Well, hi again. Yes, the second part told you how old Farmer Giles had become very famous for his bravery against the giant, but also that the giant, when he got home, had been rather, how should we put it, rather over the top is a good way. Being a tall giant, probably being over the top is a good thing to be, in explaining what a wonderful adventurer he had been and spreading the word of this area just over to the southwest somewhere that was full of wonderful food to eat and humans to terrorize. And when it was heard by a particular dragon that was particularly into frightening people and into stealing, and he was very, very rich. It just so happened that that dragon, Chrysophylax, came to Ham, and the king was informed. He'd already made quite a fuss of Farmer Giles and given him a knighthood, although he didn't get his given to him by the king at the palace, but he did give him a sword, and that was rather nice. Anyway, the knights that the king had, they weren't going to go out and fight the dragon, and it came to the point that the dragon was getting closer and closer to Ham, and the people of the village came to see Father Giles and tried very hard to get him, as ever, to save them. "We look to you," they said, and they remained standing round looking until the farmer's face was redder than his beard. "When are you going to start?" they asked. "Well, I can't start today, and that's a fact," said he. "I've a lot on hand with my cowman sick and all. I'll see about it." They went away, but in the evening it was rumoured that the dragon had moved even nearer, so they all came back. "We look to you, Master Giles," they said. "Well," said he, "it's very awkward for me just now. My mare has gone lame and the lambing has started. I'll see about it as soon as may be." So they went away once more, not without some grumbling and whispering. The miller was sniggering. The parson stayed behind and could not be got rid of. He invited himself to supper and made some pointed remarks, even asked what had become of the sword and insisted on seeing it. It was lying in a cupboard on a shelf hardly long enough for it, and as soon as Farmer Giles brought it out, in a flash it leaped from the sheath, which the farmer dropped as if it had been hot. The parson sprang to his feet, upsetting his beer. He picked up the sword carefully and tried to put it back in the sheath, but it would not go so much as a foot in, and it jumped clean out again as soon as he took his hand off the hilt. "Dear me, this is very peculiar," said the parson, and he took a good look at both scabbard and blade. He was a lettered man, but the farmer could only spell out large uncials with difficulty, and was none too sure of the reading even of his own name. That is why he had never given any heed to the strange letters that could dimly be seen on sheath and sword. As for the king's armourer, he was so accustomed to runes, names, and other signs of power and significance upon swords and scabbards that he hadn't bothered his head about them. He thought them out of date anyway. But the parson looked long, and he frowned. He had expected to find some lettering on the sword or on the scabbard, and that was indeed the idea that had come to him the day before. But now he was surprised at what he saw. For letters and signs there were, to be sure, but he could not make head nor tail of them. "There is an inscription on this sheath, and some Africal signs are visible also upon the sword," he said. "Indeed," said Giles. "And what may that amount to?" The characters are archaic, that means very old, and the language barbaric, that means very weird, said the parson to gain time. A little closer inspection will be required. He begged the loan of the sword for the night, and the farmer let him have it with pleasure. When the parson got home, he took down many learned books from the shelves, and he sat up far into the night. Next morning it was discovered that the dragon had moved nearer still. All the people of Ham barred their doors and shuttered their windows, and those that had cellars went down into them and sat shivering in the candlelight. But the parson stole out and went from door to door, and he told to all who would listen through a crack or a keyhole what he had discovered in his study. Our good Father Giles, he said, by the king's grace, is now the owner of Cordy Mordax, the famous sword that in popular romances is more vulgarly called Tailbiter. Those that heard this name usually opened the door. They all knew the renown of Tailbiter, for that sword had belonged to Bellamarius, the greatest of all the dragon slayers of the realm. Some accounts made him the maternal great-great-grandfather of the king. The songs and tales of his deeds were many, and if forgotten at court, were still remembered in the villages. This sword, said the parson, will not stay sheathed if a dragon is within 5 miles, and without doubt in a brave man's hands no dragon can resist it. Then people began to take heart again, and some unshuttered the windows and put their heads out. In the end the parson persuaded a few to come and join him, but only the miller was really willing. To see Giles in a real fix seemed to him worth the risk. They went up the hill, not without anxious looks north across the river. There was no sign of the dragon. Probably he was asleep. He had been feeding very well all the Christmas time. The parson and the miller hammered on the farmer's door. There was no answer, so they hammered louder. At last Giles came out. His face was very red. He had also sat up far into the night, drinking a good deal of ale, and he began again as soon as he got up. They all crowded round him, calling him Good Giles, Bold Giles, Great Giles, staunch farmer, pride of Ham, hero of the countryside. And they spoke of Cordy Mordax, Tailbiter, the sword that would not be sheathed, death or victory, the glory of the yeomanry, backbone of the country, and the good of one's fellow men, until the farmer's head was hopelessly confused. Now then, one at a time, he said, when he got the chance. What's all this? What's all this? It's my busy morning, you know. So they let the parson explain the situation. Then the miller had the pleasure of seeing the farmer in as tight a fix as he could wish. But things did not turn out quite as the miller expected. For one thing, Giles had drunk a great deal of strong ale. For another, he had a queer feeling of pride and encouragement when he learned that his sword was actually Tailbiter. He had been very fond of tales about Bellamarius when he was a boy, and before he had learned sense, he had sometimes wished that he could have a marvellous and heroic sword of his own. So it came over him all of a sudden that he would take Tailbiter and go dragon hunting. But he had been used to bargaining all his life, and he made one more effort to postpone the event. What, said he, me go dragon hunting in my old leggings and waistcoat? Dragon fights need some kind of armour, from all I've heard tell. There isn't any armour in this house, and that's a fact, said he. That was a bit awkward, they all allowed, but they sent for the blacksmith. The blacksmith shook his head. He was a slow, gloomy man, vulgarly known as Sonny Sam, though his proper name was Fabricius Cunctator. He never whistled at his work, unless some disaster, such as frost in May, had duly occurred after he had foretold it. Since he was daily foretelling disasters of every kind, few happened that he had not foretold, and he was able to take the credit of them. It was his chief pleasure, so naturally he was reluctant to do anything to avert them. He shook his head again. "I can't make armour out of nought," he said, "and it's not in my line. You'd best get the carpenter to make you a wooden shield. Not that it would help you much. He's a hot dragon." Their faces fell, but the miller was not so easily to be turned from his plan of sending Giles to the dragon, if he would go, or of blowing the bubble of his local reputation. If he refused in the end, "What about ring mail?" he said. "That would be a help, and it need not be very fine. It would be for business and not for showing off at court. What about your old leather jerkin, friend Giles? And there is a great pile of links and rings in the smithy. I don't suppose Master Fabricius himself knows what may be lying there." "You don't know what you're talking about," said the smith, growing cheerful. "If it's real ring mail you mean, then you can't have it. It needs the skill of dwarfs, with every little ring fitting into 4 others and all. Even if I had the craft, I should be working for weeks, and we shall all be in our graves before then," said he. "Or leastways in the dragon." They all wrung their hands in dismay, and the blacksmith began to smile. But they were now so alarmed that they were unwilling to give up the miller's plan, and they turned to him for counsel. "Well," said he, "I've heard tell that in the old days those that could not buy bright hauberks out of the Southlands would stitch steel rings on a leather shirt and be content with that. Let's see what can be done in that line." So Giles had to bring out his old jerkin, and the smith hurried back to his smithy. There they rummaged in every corner and turned over the pile of old metal, as had not been done for many a year. At the bottom they found, all dull with rust, a whole heap of small rings, fallen from some forgotten coat, such as the miller had spoken of. Sam, more unwilling and gloomy as the task seemed more helpful, was set to work on the spot, gathering and sorting and cleaning the rings, and when, as he was pleased to point out, these were clearly insufficient for one so broad of back and breast as Master Giles, they made him split up old chains and hammer the links into rings as fine as his skill could contrive. They took the smaller rings of steel and stitched them onto the breast of the jerkin, and the larger and clumsier rings they stitched on the back. And then, when still more rings were forthcoming, so hard was poor Sam driven, they took a pair of the farmer's breeches and stitched rings onto them. And up on a shelf in a dark nook of the smithy, the miller found the old iron frame of a helmet, and he set the cobbler to work, covering it with leather as well as he could. The work took them all the rest of that day, and all the next day, which was 12th night, and the eve of Epiphany. But festivities were neglected. Farmer Giles celebrated the occasion with more ale than usual, but the dragon mercifully slept. For the moment he had forgotten all about hunger or swords. Early on the Epiphany they went up the hill, carrying the strange result of their handiwork. Giles was expecting them. He had now no excuses left to offer, so he put on the mail jerkin and the breeches. The miller sniggered. Then Giles put on his top boots and an old pair of spurs, and also the leather-covered helmet. But at the last moment he clapped on an old fat felt hat over the helmet, and over the mail coat he threw his big great cloak. "What is the person of that, master?" they asked. "Well," said Giles, "if it is your notion to go dragon hunting, jingling and dingling like Canterbury bells, it ain't mine. It don't seem sense to be let a dragon know that you are coming along the road sooner than need be. An helmet's a helmet, and a challenge to battle. Let the worm see only my old hat over the edge, and maybe I'll get nearer before the trouble begins." They had stitched on the ring so that they overlapped, each hanging loose over the one below, and jingle they certainly did. The cloak did something to stop the noise of them, but Giles cut a queer figure in his gear. They did not tell him so. They girded the belt round his waist with difficulty, and they hung the scabbard upon it, but he had to carry the sword, for it would no longer stay sheathed unless held with main strength. The farmer called for Garm. He was a just man according to his lights. "Dog," he said, "you are coming with me." The dog howled. "Help! Help!" he cried. "Now stop it," said Giles, "or I'll give you worse than any dragon could. You know the smell of this worm, and maybe you'll prove useful for once." And Farmer Giles called for his grey mare. She gave him a queer look and sniffed at the spurs, but she let him get up. Then off they went, and none of them felt happy. They trotted through the village, and all the folly clapped and cheered, mostly from their windows. The farmer and his mare put as good a face on it as they could, but Garm had no sense of shame and slunk along with his tail down. They crossed the bridge over the river at the end of the village. When at last they were well out of sight, they slowed to a walk. Yet all too soon they passed out of the lands belonging to Farmer Giles and to the other folk of Ham, and came to the parts that the dragon had visited.